She was 70 and left with nothing to say until her son sent beans and rice like this. Video and subscribe for more real-life stories. By the time Rita turned 70, she believed she had already lived through every hardship life had to offer. She had buried her parents, survived a childhood with barely enough to eat, and built a life from almost nothing. She thought she understood pain. She thought she had already met the worst of it. She was wrong. Rita grew up poor, not the kind of poor people talk about in passing, the kind where you skip a vacation or wear last year's coat, real poor. The kind where dinner some nights was whatever could be stretched thin enough to feed everyone at the table, and where new clothes were something other families had, not her own. She remembered wearing shoes a size too small because there was no money for new ones. And she remembered the particular kind of quiet that settled over a house when the adults were worried about bills but didn't want the children to know it. She learned early to want less, to expect less, and to be grateful for whatever came her way. It was a lesson that would follow her for the rest of her life. For better and for worse, everything changed when she married David. He was a numbers man through and through, the kind of person who could look at a column of figures and see a story other people couldn't. He worked for a large accounting firm downtown, sharp suits and sharper instincts, while Rita kept the books for a small, local business. Together they didn't live extravagantly. They didn't need to. What they had was steady, and steady was more than either of them had grown up with. They rented a modest home, drove cars until the wheels nearly fell off, and tucked away every spare dollar they could into savings. Retirement, they told each other, would be their reward for all those years of restraint. Slowly, quietly, without anyone around them fully realizing it. That discipline built into something substantial. When Rita was 55, after years of hoping and nearly giving up, she gave birth to a son. They named him Eric. He arrived at a point in their lives when they had already made peace with the idea that children simply weren't in the cards for them. So, his arrival felt less like an addition to their family and more like a miracle neither of them had dared to ask for. Out loud, Rita left her job soon after he was born. There was no debate about it, no long conversation weighing pros and cons. She simply knew, the way a mother knows, that she wanted to be the one raising him, not someone else. Eric became the center of their world in every sense of the phrase. Birthdays were celebrated like holidays. School projects got full family involvement. Every opportunity that could be afforded to him was afforded to him, not out of excess, but out of the quiet determination of two people who had once had very little and were determined their son would never feel that same lack. When it came time for college, David and Rita made sure of one thing above all else. Eric would graduate without a cent of debt hanging over his future. It was their gift to him, paid for in decades of restraint. Neither of them ever complained about that then. In Eric's third year of college, everything shifted. David died suddenly of a heart attack. There was no warning, no slow decline to prepare for. Just an ordinary day that ended in a hospital hallway and a silence that swallowed the house whole. Eric wanted to leave school immediately. He called Rita in tears, insisting he would come home, that his mother shouldn't be alone, that his education could wait. Rita refused to hear it. She told him, as firmly as grief allowed her to speak, that finishing his degree was exactly what his father would have wanted, and that nothing would honor David more than Eric building the life they had worked so hard to give him. So Eric stayed at school, and Rita learned to sit in an empty house by herself. That same year, Eric met a young woman named Julie. The first time he brought her home, Rita felt something tighten in her chest, a mother's instinct that rarely announces itself with words, just a quiet, persistent unease. She couldn't have explained it if asked. Julie was polite enough, said all the right things at dinner, smiled in all the right places, but something about her felt calculated, as though every kindness came with an invisible price tag attached. Eric, however, was smitten. To him, Julie was wonderful, and nothing his mother said, or more accurately didn't say, was going to change his mind. Eric graduated, landed a solid job, and not long after, he and Julie were married. Rita attended the wedding, smiled for the photographs, and told herself that perhaps she had been wrong about her new doula. Perhaps it was simply grief talking, or the natural wariness of a mother watching her only child build a life with someone new. But the visits grew rare. Holidays came and went with phone calls instead of company. Brief conversations that lasted just long enough to check a box before both sides moved on with their day. Rita spent most birthdays alone, most holidays with the television for company, telling herself it was simply how life went once children grew up and built their own worlds. When Eric and Julie did make the trip to see her, the pattern was always the same. Eric would ask his mother how she was doing, whether she needed anything, whether there was some way he could help, and before Rita could even answer, Julie would cut in smoothly, telling him not to embarrass his mother, insisting that Rita looked perfectly fine, that she clearly didn't need a thing. Eric would nod, reassured, and the subject would close as quickly as it opened. Rita noticed, every single time, how quickly her son let the matter drop, how easily he accepted his wife's version of things over his own eyes. It stung more than she ever let on. The truth was, Rita was fine. In fact, she was far better than fine. And neither of them had the slightest idea just how well off she really was. What Rita hadn't known, not until after David's death, was that her husband had spent years quietly investing in real estate. It wasn't something he'd hidden out of secrecy or mistrust. It was simply David's way, methodical and private, building something steady in the background, the same way he'd built their savings. Shortly after the funeral, David's lawyer asked Rita to come into his office. There, spread across the desk, were documents outlining properties David had purchased over the years, properties that now belonged entirely to her, houses, land, a villa tucked away on the coast of Spain. David had left her remarkably quietly. Well off, though. Rita said nothing to Eric or Julie, not out of cruelty, but out of caution. She knew Julie's nature, or at least she suspected it strongly enough to want proof before she ever revealed the truth. So she decided to test the waters. She would wait and watch and see what her son and his wife would do if they believed she had nothing at all. The test came on her 68th birthday. Eric called, as he always did, and asked the question he always asked. Was she doing okay? Did she need anything? For the first time in years, Rita didn't brush the question aside. She told him the truth, or at least a version crafted for the occasion. She said she was having trouble affording groceries, and that she needed help getting her blood pressure medication. There was a pause on the line, a stunned kind of silence, as though the words didn't quite fit the mother he thought he knew, but he recovered quickly and told her not to worry, that he would send Julie over that same day. True to his word, Julie arrived that afternoon. In her hands was a small paper grocery bag. Rita opened it slowly, half expecting to be surprised, half already knowing she wouldn't be. Inside was a bag of dry beans and a small sack of rice. That was all. No fresh produce, no meat, no medication, nothing that resembled real help for an elderly woman supposedly struggling to get by. Rita stood in her doorway holding the bag, and something inside her went very still and very clear. She told herself that surely Eric couldn't have known what Julie brought. Surely her son wouldn't have approved of sending his own mother a bag of dry goods and calling it care. Then the phone rang later that evening, and it was Eric asking casually whether she'd received the beans and rice Julie had dropped off. He said it so easily, so without shame, that Rita understood in that instant it hadn't been Julie's idea alone. Whatever compassion Eric had once shown her over the phone had apparently never been strong enough to survive contact with his wife's influence, or perhaps it had simply never been as deep as Rita had wanted to believe. In that moment, sitting alone in the house she and David had built their whole lives around, Rita made a decision, not in anger, not in one wild, reckless burst of emotion, but with the same quiet, deliberate clarity David had once used to build their fortune. Eric and Julie would never see a single penny of what she had. Not now, not ever. She began making arrangements almost immediately. Among the properties David had left her was that villa on the coast of Spain, a place she had never even visited, tucked away in a life she hadn't known was waiting for her. Within days, Rita packed a single suitcase, left the rest of her belongings behind exactly as they were, and boarded a flight that same night. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She simply left. Spain, when she finally arrived, felt like stepping into a life that had been waiting patiently for her to claim. The light was different there, warmer somehow, and the villa sat overlooking the asterisks. Water as though it had been built specifically for a woman, finally ready to put herself first. The mornings smelled like the sea and fresh bread from the bakery down the road. And in the evenings, Rita would sit on the terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sun sink into the water, and feel something in her chest loosen that had been tight for years without her quite realizing it. Rita settled in slowly, cautiously, the way anyone does when starting over at 70 years old. She learned a handful of Spanish phrases, found a small market where the vendors began to recognize her face, and made a friend or two among the other expatriates who had washed up on that same stretch of coastline looking for a second chance of their own. But settle in, she did, more fully and more happily than she ever imagined possible. Weeks later, once she felt steady enough, she sat down and wrote Eric a letter. In it, she told him everything: the properties, the money, the villa, all of it, laid out plainly with no bitterness, dressing up the truth. She told him she wasn't coming back, and she closed the letter with a line she meant every word of. If he and Julie ever found themselves hungry, she would be more than happy to send them some beans and rice. Rita never looked back. For the first time since David's death, and perhaps for the first time in her entire life, she was living for no one but herself. Like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories. Asterisks.